And now a continuation of our REST charity registration code. Previously, we looked at the configuring REST using Spring MVC. We looked at our code where we had separate dispatcher servlets defined in our configuration class. We had separate context configuration class. So now we'll look at our web and REST controllers and how we separated the context config of the REST controller and the web controller. So here is how we segregate our controllers with stereotype annotation. We create our own meta annotation. This is for our web controllers. And then we created another one for the REST controller. And we already kind of looked at our separate context configurations. We have our web servlet context configuration and our REST servlet context configuration. And here is a demonstration of what we looked at in our Bootstrap class previously. So let's go over to Eclipse. Here is our Bootstrap class. So we see the web application context and we see the REST context, which is also a web application context. So now let's look at what we did. So if we look at our REST endpoint advice, see this is a meta annotation we created for ourselves. Then if we look at the REST endpoint itself, we have another meta annotation. And when we look at our registration REST endpoint, we decorate it with our meta annotation. And in here, we have the mapping of all the options that comes in via HTTP. And we also use the registration form. And if we look at the registration controller, we have the meta web controller, which maps to registration. And here we can see we use the model and view for Spring MVC. So in other words, this is where we see our web user interface. They are on different URL endpoints, but they essentially provide the same functionality. They both delegate all the CRUD, the create, read, and updates to the underlying registration service. So we can do that through the web UI. And if we look at the registration endpoint, we see we can also do that through the REST UI. Now this is obviously a different endpoint, so we don't step on each other when we come in from a REST API or when we use our web UI interface. Of course, the ultimate goal would actually be to have your web UI call your REST API, and then essentially you have your REST API as the front end for all your UIs, whether it's your phone or your smart device, or of course what we have here, our regular web application. And now we'll demonstrate our code by adding some debug points in our service for get registration and save registration. And in our registration controller, we can look at the create, and this is the web controller that maps to the JSP views. And this is our web controller annotation. And if we look at our REST endpoint, we can add one here to our read. So let's debug our app. Debug as, debug on server. Here is our web UI launched, and we go to our debug view in Eclipse, and we see all of our breakpoints. So let's log in and add a registration. Create charity registration. We'll add a JPEG image, submit, and we enter the create breakpoint on our registration controller. create a new registration, set the username, set subject, set body, process attachments, save it. Let's resume. And here we are hitting the default registration service, add a date, and we add the registration to the in-memory database. So we'll resume, and we hit the breakpoint in the add, set the new registration ID, and we put it into our key value in-memory database. So we'll resume, and then it returns it. Here we're still in our default registration. Now let's go back to our user interface. See, it's created. So now we'll test the UI using SOAP UI. We open our REST project and we have a get registration by ID, and we see we have the get and the REST endpoint with the parameter of 1. We'll hit that and we see that it comes back with the value that we've just entered. And that concludes this tutorial. I will see you in the next one.